Hello. Today in my writing process playlist I'm going to discuss my tertiary characters for my novel New Eleusis. So these characters are not part of the main triad. They are, the best way to put it is they all have a purpose, a very distinct purpose. So I'm kind of developing them together. So how I do that is similar to how I did my secondary characters, because they are kind of a duad. If you want to check that video out, you're welcome to do that. And I discuss this a little more in depth in that video. Like my secondary character spreadsheet, this one basically has much of the same information. I'm focusing in on these four characters. One of them is the antagonist, Mallory. The second two are characters that I need to kind of define the plot. So they're quite important, but they're not really part of my main triad. And the fourth one is also very important, but also kind of in the distance, I think is the best way to describe her. She will play a part, but much later in the book. You know, it's nice to make this together because I can kind of see how the different characters compare and contrast. It just makes it a little bit easier, and it will be easier later when I print this stuff up to look at it quickly. I can just jump to a certain part of the spreadsheet. Now, I am also going to write short backstories on all four of these characters, but I will do that in the outlining stage. I'm going to do a video on backstories. So if we jump over to the novel factory again, you can see that I have my protagonist, who I've discussed in a previous video in depth, and then I have my two secondary characters, Lux and Selena, and I discussed them in the previous video. In this case, I have the four characters, but unfortunately I've only been able to find photos for two of them. For Mallory, I could not find one person that kind of defined my vision of him in my head. So I actually had to kind of opt for three different people. Now this guy is a very dominating force in the book. He's the antagonist. So basically what I had to do is combine this man with this guy and they both have very interesting backgrounds that I will throw on the screen here for you. All three of these people are famous. And if you know this person's eyes, this is Richard Ramirez. And I don't want the person to look like him per se, but I put the photo there to kind of capture this character's eyes when he gets worked up. So he's going to be kind of a, I don't think this is a spoiler, but he's going to be kind of a double-edged character where sometimes, like in this case, you know, he's very happy, but then he has a temper and he kind of switches more to these. Yeah, I mean, it was hard to find one picture to kind of sum it all up, so I kind of have to make a composite of all these people. In the case of Karis, I found this very old actress from Japan, and she's perfect. It was kind of serendipity, similar to some of the other photos I found in previous video. I just kind of stumbled upon her, and she apparently is quite famous in Japan. I'll list a few of her more known films. I'm going to base it off of her, but I should say this character is going to be a little bit darker than the person in these photos. This is just kind of the aesthetic of what I want her to look like. But she's going to have a little bit more kind of bitterness and edge to her. So that is something I'll have to define in the writing. And the last two, Thomas Brown and Elise Becker, I have not been able to locate photos for them yet. I've looked, but nothing has really struck me. And that's part of the process of writing a book, is sometimes you just don't have that missing piece and you kind of have to wait until you come across it. So in this case, I'm going to keep defining their characters, but I don't exactly know what they look like yet or what I'm going for in that regard. I'll know it when I see it. I'm going to make threads for all of these major characters, and I will define more of their actions and stuff in the outline before I actually get to the writing process. But the main thing to remember about any character in your book, but specifically characters that are kind of off to the side, you could say your secondary or tertiary, but most of these characters exist for a specific purpose. Now, your protagonist obviously is the one that you need to kind of put most attention to. But that doesn't mean that these other characters that might appear in your book for a few chapters or might have a very pivotal purpose, that doesn't mean you shouldn't develop those as well. All the characters should feel real. So even if it's a side player or someone making kind of a cameo, it's good to have, at least in your head, some backstories about them, or different things that help flesh them out. So when you're making these kind of tertiary characters, these are some things you should think about. The first thing is, are they an assist? What I mean by that is, are they there to help the protagonist? If they are, you need to figure out how, and you need to keep that in mind when you're developing their personality, because there's nothing worse than in a story people's motivations are all over the map. I think it's important to use the Enneagrams, like I mentioned in the previous two videos, to develop their personality. And often when I'm making these characters, I will figure out what their purpose is, then develop their personality based off their purpose. So I kind of reverse engineer it. And the reason I do that is because then I can figure out why they are serving this function. Why are they doing it? Another one would be if they are a conflict to your protagonist or an obstacle of some kind. I think it's important, again, to figure out why they're there first and then reverse engineer it. In fact, I would say when you're talking about the different kinds of characters, the protagonist, I think the story comes from the protagonist's point of view, from their personality. That's how it kind of unfolds. Whereas the further away you get from the protagonist, I think those characters, you need to look at it in reverse to make it fit into what you're trying to accomplish with the protagonist. It's good to have characters that explain things, but when I say that, I don't mean like just info dumps. Like you see this a lot in TV shows where some guy in the office comes and just dumps a bunch of info and then leaves. That's like the worst way to do it. However, you can have characters that know a lot about certain things, and if you do it right, I think you can deliver lots of information through them. Some characters are kind of set dressing. They add flavor to your world. Something like the orcs in Lord of the Rings or the dwarves. They serve a purpose, but they're also there to create this kind of background atmosphere. All of these characters should forward the plot somehow, though, even if it's in a minor way. I don't really like having characters in my books that are just there for no reason. There might be a few that are just something on the edge where someone sees this person or they do one small minor action, but like most of the time I want them to be a moving part of the plot and just integral to the plot. And the last thing that you should consider is whether the character is dynamic or static. And what I mean by that is, do they change? Do they evolve, or do they stay the same throughout the story? If you think of someone like Yoda, Yoda basically stays the same. But if you compare him to Gandalf, Gandalf goes through a transition. He goes from the gray, Gandalf the gray, to the white. So it's important to know, if you're going to have an arc for this character, or are they just there for specific reasons? The last thing I'm going to say, this is a little bit off topic, but I thought about it the other day, and I think this is something that people don't really realize with writing. I think they just think, you create an outline, you sit down, you start writing. And I've said this in previous videos that it's not that simple. There's this old British Army military adage that they call the 7 Ps. And I think this really sums it up. The 7 Ps are proper planning and preparation prevents piss poor performance. And how that relates to writing is all these little steps I'm doing in these 10 videos so far, it doesn't seem like I'm getting anywhere in terms of the actual book, but I've made huge strides in a short time, not necessarily on paper, but in my head. And all of these different schematics and diagrams and things I'm making, those are all ways for me to formulate this thing in my head. And I wouldn't say all of the books that I've written are this complicated. This could be the most complicated book that I've tackled. However, I do think that if you don't do all this, when it comes time to sit down and get in the flow state, bust out the first draft, it's going to be slower and it's going to be less in the zone, and it's just not going to be fresh. So if you plan properly, then your performance increases. So if you have anything that you'd like to comment on, you're welcome to do that in the comments. If you know anyone that would benefit from this video, you can share it with them. You can like and subscribe and do all that also if you'd like to. And that's about all I got. Have a good day. Take care.